I'm indifferent.
I don't believe in God.
To the existence of
God is not judging them.
I don't have proof.
I don't know how to pray.
They're judging themselves.
Where is God in all of this? This is my home.
God exists.
What does it say about God that he created the orgasm?
I don't pledge allegiance to anything.
I don't pray.
Only to God.
If there was a God,
And I thought,
I just have this understanding that life is hard.
he could never love me after this.
God is still good.
Welcome to Maybe God's YouTube channel. My name's Eric Huffman, and if you haven't already, of course, we would love it if you would subscribe to our channel and like this video and ring the notification bell so you can be updated on all of our most recent content as it is released. Today, I'm joined by an awesome husband and wife pastor team, a clergy couple out of Green Bay, Wisconsin. Sonny and Shawn Hennessy are the pastors of Life Church Green Bay, and Shawn is also the chaplain of the Green Bay Packers of the NFL. They're also the hosts of a great podcast called The Rise After the Fall, where they take an honest and vulnerable look at church culture and the lives of fallen leaders inside those churches. So I just want to welcome to our podcast today, Sonny and Shawn Hennessy.
Well, thanks. Thank you for having us.
Really glad that we have a chance to do this. I have followed y'all's work and your ministry for quite some time now, and I'm really honored, actually, to be able to talk to y'all because I have mad respect for what y'all are doing. So thank you for being here.
Well, thanks. Thank you.
Of course. So why don't we just start by talking about the most important issue of the day, which is, Shawn, your Green Bay Packers, man. What are you thinking about in terms of 2023? Is Aaron Rodgers staying around? As the chaplain, I'm sure you're also like a spokesman for the team. Like, what do you see in the future?
Yeah, I think I don't know. Honestly, it's up in the air.
More importantly, have you had a talk with Mr. Rodgers about the dangers of ayahuasca?
I have not.
All right. It might be time.
Yeah, maybe.
Based on what I've seen and heard from the Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah.
Anyhow, that's a really cool side gig you've got there, bro.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I love it. This is my 5th season, and it's incredibly rewarding. And at the same time, it can get really sad, particularly when guys leave because you get really close to them. And I'm kind of at an age where I'm old enough to be their dad.
Right.
It's just a weird thing for me. Sometimes I look at Sonny and I go, I feel like we're grown-ups. And I'm going to be 50 in October. And she goes, you're long past going to be a grown-up. You're plenty of a grown-up.
Right.
So, when you see
this
other teams, it's, I keep up with them, but it's kind of it's one of the sad side effects.
Sure. No, I get it. Let's talk a little bit about your story, though, and sort of what brought you to this point in your life. And we'll start with Shawn. You weren't always on track to become a pastor. Is that right? Like you don't have a typical pastor story where, no, it was always meant to be.
Yeah, I came to the Lord late in the game. I actually got saved in a football locker room. And football's kind of always been a story of my life, and it's been intertwined. And I was living the life of a Division I athlete and got arrested and convicted of a felony.
Okay.
And,
what felony?
Felony robbery.
All right.
And I actually got out on a technicality. I served 111 days of a 15-year sentence, and I got out on a
15-year sentence?
15 years, man.
And you got out?
I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life in prison.
Wow.
And I kind of had reserved myself to that fact and was prepared for that, I think, mentally and emotionally. And I got out, and by the grace of God, I would say now, but at the time I thought it was just the luck of the draw. I went to a school in North Dakota that I didn't know it was a Christian school. And when I got there, the first thing I tried to do is buy weed off of a guy named Scott Sneer from Salem, Oregon. And he told me that I didn't need weed, I needed Jesus. And
wow.
So every day for 6 weeks, Scott Sneer shared Jesus with me, told me these were his words. He said, you need to get saved. And before our first game in Rapid City, South Dakota, the football coach came in to give his pep talk, and his pep talk was John 3:16. And I don't know what the point of that was. I don't know if it was like Jesus gave his all. We need to give our all. We're going to lay it all on the line. I don't know what the parallel was on that. But I know when he read John 3:16, I started to cry. And I looked over, and next to me, smiling like the Cheshire Cat, was Scott Sneer from Salem, Oregon. And I said, I need to get saved. And we went into the shower room. And I got down on my knees because that's what I thought people who prayed needed to do. And they led me through a prayer and then they baptized me in the shower. And
Wow.
and it was an instantaneous change for me. There was a definite, I mean, I had a lot of hurdles that I needed to overcome. I had a lot of baggage, obviously, that I needed to get rid of. But
Yeah.
I was 20. And so to have 2 decades of an old life, a difficult life. I grew up in the inner city. I grew up in a little bit of a dysfunctional family. And so there was a huge learning curve. And I think I spent the large part of my Christianity as a massive skeptic, partially because of the baggage that I carried. And I had a lot of trust issues.
Yeah.
And so your podcast is so incredible in the fact that I think at times in the church, we don't deal with skepticism. We want to hide our head in the sand because we're afraid of answers that questions we don't know the answers to.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about sort of the conditions and circumstances that led to you, committing this crime that, you could have ended up in jail for 15 years for, and just sort of what was going on. That doesn't just happen in a vacuum or accidentally. What was happening in your life that led you to be so desperate?
Well, I mean, I kind of lived a life of crime growing up, and I come from a line of criminals. I've got uncles that, did long bits. Like, I have an uncle who was sentenced to life in prison, and I just felt like
Wow.
it was part of my DNA. And the neighborhood that I came out of, there really wasn't that many tracks out. You could join the military, you could die, you could get a scholarship. And I didn't want to join the military or die. So, I went on this football scholarship. But what I discovered, Eric, is no matter where you go, you're with yourself. You take you with you. And so I actually didn't commit a crime out of desperation. I committed it out of convenience. And we were just broke. Back then there were no NILs. You didn't get to get money when you're on a scholarship. So I had a roommate who told me that there was an apartment near our apartment that was full of stuff, and he never saw anybody come or go. And so he said, I think we should go rob that place. And I was like, yeah, I think we should. I'm sick of eating ramen and cheese. And so we went in, and I picked the lock, and we stole. The value of goods was so high that it became a felony. And so it took less than 24 hours for me to be caught. And it's interesting when you're guilty and you get caught. There's a certain point where you just reserve yourself to the fact that you go, this was inevitable. I felt like at some point I was going to spend my life incarcerated. So this was just the time.
And what's interesting is even there's a freedom in getting caught.
Yeah.
And we saw that in our own then marriage later, that when it was like, you know what, it's good to just come clean.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Yeah. Stop running from whatever you're running from. Right. So what was the saving grace? Was it getting accepted into this school after all of the shenanigans and the good luck of getting out of prison at 115 days or whatever?
Well, I think, I had one guy who was a coach, and he was really concerned about me. And his name was Jerry Grimshaw, and he had been in the military. And I think he just treated me kind of like a son, but it was a little more tough love, I think, because of his military background. And the idea of, I come from a culture of loyalty. It's sometimes it's your life depends on it. Yeah. And so for me, to have a place that took a chance on me, I had a 0 GPA, an NCAA rule violation, and a felony. And so for them to take me in, after my freshman year, I had an opportunity to go back and play at other big Division I schools. And I just felt like beyond the Jesus thing, I felt a sense of loyalty to a place that would take a chance on me. And so I just went all in. And then, of course, my sophomore year, the love of my life walked into the cafeteria. And the first time that I saw her, I looked at the guy who was sitting next to me, who was my roommate at the time. And I said, bro, I'm going to marry that girl. He goes, who is she? What's her name? I said, I don't know. And I'm going to find out, and I'm going to marry her. And so here she is 26 years later.
What was it about her?
Really, honestly, the first thing I noticed about her was her calves. She has incredible
I'm gonna marry them calves, man.
Yeah. If my calves were as muscular as Sonny's, I would have been in the NFL. And then it was her personality. She was disengaging. She was funny. There was no BS about her. She called me out on stuff, and she still calls me 26 years later. She's still calling me out on stuff. So
what happened at the school where, I mean, you get sort of summarily dismissed, or there was some trauma that took place at the school, if I'm not mistaken?
At the first school, I've been dismissed from more than one school.
The university.
Yeah. I think it was an embarrassment to the school. I think there's certain things that you just can't recover from. And, you know, when you're locked up in the county jail, they just go, let's just move on. It is a bit of a business too, you know. I mean, Division I sports is a bit of a business, and when it's so much money involved in it that I think at some point I was just a bad investment, not just financially, but from every aspect. I was a bit of a wreck.
Right. How did you end up being reinstated?
Well, I had to go to a smaller school, and the school that I went to wasn't even an NCAA school. And I'd think that there were, you know, I mean, we're talking, this was, 30 years ago. So there were so many different rules even at the time. And we had a collection of guys that were kind of, it would almost have been like a JUCO, if you're familiar with that. You know, we have guys that were kind of bounce back players. And I was the only guy that lasted from that whole recruiting class. And I think part of it is because I legitimately had a genuine conversion. Like I was so in love with Jesus from the beginning, even though my actions didn't always show it. And I was kicked out of that school as well. And they took the same guy, Jerry Grimshaw, that football coach. He went to the president of the school and he put his job on the line. He said, I will personally be responsible for him. I guarantee he will not mess up again. And if he does, you can fire me when you kick him out.
Yeah.
Dang. That is amazing. I mean, that's a risk, a huge risk to take.
Yeah, I mean, he had a wife, 2 kids, a house, a car, you know, it was crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So the second time, walk me through, I'm getting all of your school suspensions confused now. Walk me through the second time at the smaller school. What happened there?
Well, I got caught smoking weed in the dorm rooms. So that's kind of,
college.
Yeah, it was a Bible college. It was an assembly Bible school. And actually, you know, I have a picture of it. I had on basketball shorts, no shirt, a giant purple foam cowboy hat, and the room is filled with smoke. And the dean of the school walked in, and I was smoking a joint. And when he walked in, I lifted it up and I offered him a hit. That's just polite to me,
bro.
You know, and
just polite.
He pulls me into his office and he said, dude, you can't smoke weed and be saved. And I was like, well, I didn't know that. Like, I just got into this team. You know, it's like, well, if I would have known that, I definitely wouldn't have been doing it in the dorms, but I probably wouldn't have been doing it anyway. Cause I'm a bit of a rule person. Like if you tell me you can't do this and I believe in what it is that you're subscribed to, then I'll toe the line.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's another example, I think, of an important thing for Christians to keep in mind, which is when someone comes to Christ, like in some ways the change can be instant and complete. But in most of the examples I can think of, people that come to Christ bring their habits and old sort of ways with them, and it kind of takes some time to work them through and work them out. And for the new law of Christ's grace to set in, and for us to learn how to respond to that as opposed to the old ways that we've been living. And sometimes there's a little bit of a gray zone for a convert like you smoking weed at a Christian college, right? Like we have to be really understanding.
Well, that's why they're saying old habits die hard.
That's right.
And it's not easy to get away from some of the things that you're into, which is, you know, I'm not trying to segue or anything, but it's one of the reasons why we do what it is that we do. And the program for restoration is that there are people who have issues that are so deeply buried, that have been so intertwined within who and what they are for so long, that sometimes they've even forgotten the fact that they have that, or why they have it, how it happened. And so if we can figure out how to unlock that, there's a lot of people who are doing things that they don't want to do.
Right.
Even when they're in a position of spiritual authority.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And one thing that's really interesting to me about your story at this stage that I do sort of vividly recall is how you were sort of brought back into the school's good graces and sort of given their stamp of approval again. They heard you like singing or something, like you're a singer. You can sing on top of everything else.
Yes, they did. I sang at a wedding, and the president of the school approached me and asked me if I would travel with him as he preached and promoted the school, and if I would sing and open up for him. And I said, well, I don't even go to school here anymore. So he said, well, you let me worry about that. So
wow.
That's history.
Which is beautiful and good, and I'm so glad that happened for you. But in light of the conversation we're about to have today, it's one example of how the deeper issues that need ministry can be sort of forgotten in light of extraordinary talent. Like when someone's really gifted and talented, like you clearly are, and I've never heard you sing, but I assume you sang well enough to, to earn your way back into school. But sometimes that is a blessing and a curse. It's a mixed bag because it can cause everyone and you to forget about like the deeper ministry that needs to be done here and how this person, what their deepest needs are. And we in the church we'll talk more about this later, but we tend to prop up really talented people that have deeper things going on that need work, right?
Definitely. Well, it's the old saying that we heard, that where your talent will take you places that your character can't keep you.
Oof. That's good. I haven't heard that one in a while, but that's really good and scary for everyone that spends their Sunday mornings on stage somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, something to always be mindful of. All right. So is it fair to say that you were not really spiritually prepared to be put in the spotlight at that point in your life?
Oh, I wasn't spiritually, emotionally, maturity, none of the above.
Right. So
Shawn really went all in, like he said, like abstinent from drugs, alcohol, like don't touch beer, wine for 15, 20 years. I mean, it was like, just, I'll do everything I'm supposed to now that I know. But what happens is when you realize, oh, there's some like flexibility and grace with God, like abstinence of certain things doesn't equal perfection. So, I can maybe then, a lot of the pastors and leaders we work with, they've developed a hidden life, a compartmentalized life. And so they know stay really clean here, but in the spotlight, but not so much behind closed doors.
Yeah, that is a tangled web, and I want to get more into that very thing with you guys in just a second. But Sonny, let's pick up with your story for a minute, because it's fascinating in a whole different set of ways. So, how did you end up in pastoral ministry?
I was in a small town in South Dakota. I was raised on a ranch until I was age 12. I mean, when I say a ranch, I mean there were 5 people that lived within a 10-mile radius outside of my family. Wow. And then we were still an hour from Mount Rushmore area in South Dakota. So I went then to a little school, all of my years, different small schools. And then my aunt, I'll back up. I was going to be a perfect Christian once I got saved. And my plan was that I would stay pure until marriage and not have sex. I had a t-shirt that said, "I'm not doing it." I proudly wore around 8th and 9th grade.
It just said, "I'm not doing it," just like that.
Yeah. Well, it was a Josh McDowell t-shirt because he and another lady were doing purity conferences for teenagers, pep assemblies. And we had a lady come to our public school. I can't think of her name right now, but on the back of the t-shirt, it said like 90 reasons I'm not. Yeah. Because, I want to wait till marriage. I want to, protect myself, all the different things. On the front, it said, "I'm not doing it." On the back, it was like, "Why you don't have sex until you're married." So I was so excited that was going to be my story, and made it about almost 2 years and fell madly in love at age 14. To the love of my life, not Shawn, unfortunately.
It happens. Yeah,
I thought it was the love of my life. And I was the one. He was a guy who didn't care about that, but he knew I did. And I was the one that said, "We're going to get married anyway. I love you so much. Let's have sex." I got pregnant. And
Wow.
I got pregnant at 14. And at 15, I go to my sophomore year pregnant in a maternity outfit to high school. And so this was quite the story for people. My parents were large employers in town, so they loved that this little rich girl got what she had coming. She was preaching at people with her t-shirt, and now she's pregnant. And so bullying went to, we didn't really call it bullying back then, 20 some years ago. We called it picking on, but that went to a whole new level. I got to 23 weeks along in my pregnancy, and I'm in typing class, not computer, typing class.
Right, I remember.
And I felt like something's weird, and basically I went into labor at 23 weeks along as a 15-year-old. And when I go to the doctor, they're like, the baby's coming, and we can save, the doctor looked at my mom and said, we can save your daughter or the baby. Obviously, he was interested in saving me. And so I did have a baby at 15. She lived for 4 hours. And so I go from 15, now I'm a mom, but I'm also a mom who's lost a baby, to I'm a sophomore in high school. So I grew up quick, graduated a year early, went to Bible college because my Aunt Judy just took me under her wing and was a great woman of God, and I wanted to be like her. And so she took me to camp, youth camp, Bible camp, and I got called to ministry. And I didn't know that you could, as a woman, be anything but like a teacher overseas. I mean, this was 50 years ago, but 20 years ago, I was like, this is 95 or 96. I was like, I want to go into ministry. I guess I can be a missionary and try to be a nurse or a teacher overseas. So I didn't care. I just went to Bible college, and that's where he saw my calves and changed me.
What did you see in him? Did he also have nice calves or anything going on?
He had a shaved head like this. I liked the bad boy, the rebel boy. So I wanted to be the good church girl per se, but I liked the rebel boy. Right. And so what I saw in him was he looked and was the coolest guy on campus, because all the other boys were kind of dorky. We're at a small Bible college. I was like, I'm called to ministry, but I want to find a guy. So, I mean, it was preseason, and he played football and I played volleyball. Yeah. And we met in the cafeteria preseason before the school year even started. All right. And we dated immediately.
Yeah. Did y'all get engaged while in college? Like, how fast did things happen?
Oh, man.
If we
you tell him.
Well, so I was 17 still and at college, and he was 21. Yeah. And we went on a walk. And at the end of the walk, it was just a walk, I looked at him and I said, if you don't think this is going to end in marriage, we should end it now. And he just looked at me. He goes, can I let you know in the morning? And I went back to my dorm and flopped down on the bed and told my roommate, who had introduced me to him and who liked him, actually. I said, I just blew it. Like, we're not dating. I told him this. She goes, oh my gosh. And the next day he acted like nothing happened. And then a couple days later, he had me picking out utensils for his apartment. And I was like, maybe he wants to marry me. And then that's August. And at Christmas time, we went home to my parents, and he asked me to marry him. I was still 17. Wow. He asked my dad's permission. My dad was probably like, look, she's been pregnant, had a baby,
went to college.
You can have her.
She's all yours.
Yeah. My parents were excited that he appeared to be a Christian. And we got married by February. So our first year anniversary, that was our first year of even knowing each other.
Wow. Amazing. What an amazing story. Did any of what you went through ever make you doubt your call to ministry, Sonny? Like, I know what you went, the most dramatic part you went through before you really got your call with Aunt Judy, but in retrospect, looking back, did you ever think maybe I'm not really called and I just sort of felt it in an emotional way?
I think I knew that I knew. I even knew as a little girl. My hero was Pastor Paul. He was our senior pastor in our little church in South Dakota, in Belfouche, South Dakota. And I mean, he would have been almost 60 years old at that point, and I'm 9, 10, 11. And he taught the girls' Sunday school class. he's the senior pastor. There's Sunday school teachers throughout the church every Sunday before church, but I think he chose to teach the 4th and 5th grade girls Sunday school class. Luckily, because his daughter was a year older than me. And I think he wanted to teach her. And I just thought he was the greatest man that ever walked.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
that's so awesome.
I fell in love back then, way pre all of the drama. And I didn't see him and think, I'm a woman, I'm a girl, I don't know how I could ever be him. He just was amazing to me. And I thought, to do anything even close to being around people like a Pastor Paul, I'll do whatever it takes.
Wow, that's so sweet. I love how God puts people in our path that impact us, like Pastor Paul and Scott Sneer.
Yeah, right.
And others. So cool. So how did this end up happening where you go into ministry together? I'm guessing it sounds like, Sonny, you had a clearer idea about your call. Shawn, when did yours materialize?
Yeah, I think my senior year, I always wanted to go play pro ball. And I think maybe a month into my senior year, I had a dream where I felt like I just woke up from this dream and there was a word going over and over in my mind, and it was the word Raleigh. And so the only thing I knew about Raleigh was that it was a city. And so I came downstairs, I told Sonny, and we went to the Rand McNally Atlas and looked up Raleigh and discovered that it was in Raleigh. There was a Raleigh in North Carolina. And so I called the Assembly of God office in North Carolina. And to make a very long story short, they connected me with Raleigh First Assembly of God. And I talked to a guy who was a senior pastor at the time named Mike Stewart. And from October until May, I was his lead candidate to be his youth pastor. Okay. And then things changed. He got sick, and then he ended up going to a conference after he got well. And when he was at the conference, he met a guy and hired him on the spot. Oh. And so I was the only guy to graduate my senior year without a job. So we went back to her parents' ranch, and I worked as a ranch hand where they made fun of me every day. They called me Crawl, like off the Pauly Shore son-in-law movie. I didn't know anything about being on a ranch. I thought the cows bite. And I was a wreck.
And that straw hats were wicker hats?
Straw hats were called wicker hats. And so one day in frustration, I had thought, well, I've spent my whole life singing. Like, why don't I go to Nashville and try to make it in the Christian music industry? And so I called the Tennessee office of the Assemblies of God. And I said I was looking to move to Nashville. I wanted to be a youth pastor. So he said, well, we don't have anything in Nashville, but we do have one guy. He's looking for a youth pastor. He goes through youth pastors. He's had 7 youth pastors in the last 6 years. He runs them out of the ministry. He might would hire you.
Sounds great.
So they gave me the phone number, and I called him. I still remember the number, 901-386-5055. And Martha answered the phone and said, good morning, Raleigh Assembly of God. How may I direct your call?
What?
And dude, I hung up the phone because I thought I had called the wrong number.
Dodged the bullet.
Because Raleigh, North Carolina's area code was 910. So I thought I had mistakenly called the church in Raleigh because I'd called them so many times. So I called back. Very carefully dialed the number, and she answered again, Raleigh Assembly of God. And I said, is this the church that's pastored by Dr. J.D. Middlebrook? And she said, yes, sir, it is. And I said, can I speak to him? So she put me through, and he answered, and he was very stately. He had a mustache before mustaches were cool. He was so stately. And he answered the phone, and he said, this is Dr. J.D. Middlebrook. And I said, well, good morning. This is Shawn Hennessy. I'm your new youth pastor. He laughed, and he said, well, perhaps we should meet. So they put us on a plane, and they flew us to Memphis, Tennessee, and that's where we started in youth ministry. And it was just such a God thing. And I just, I had other opportunities. I could have gone on and continued to play football. I wasn't good enough to play in the NFL, but there were other options that I could have taken that route. But I just having this is going to sound so churchy, Eric, but like for me, I felt like I had a word from the Lord.
Mm.
And it felt like if I would have strayed from that word that God had given me over my life, that I didn't want to gamble on what that would mean. And it probably comes back to the loyalty thing. And so, honestly, I'd like to say that I've never regretted not continuing down the path of football, but I think at times I have, like when we were first in ministry, we didn't have any money. I thought about
that's
it.
rough.
But from a fulfillment standpoint, it just was so clear to me that this was what God had for me to do.
And I mean, something must have taken off quickly, because I started hearing about you guys several years ago after you were well established in the church you planted. Is that correct? You planted the church?
Kind of. It was we had to replant it. Yeah, a new one.
Yeah. So how did that escalate so quickly? And what did y'all's partnership and ministry look like through that?
Well, he's poking me to go ahead and answer this. So after we were in Memphis, Tennessee, we youth pastored in a couple different great churches and really were exposed to what good, fruitful church could look like. Then we went to senior pastor in Detroit because we'd be near his family, the Canadian border of Windsor. We thought, let's do that. We had at home fought and acted like immature adults, immature children, really. But we were really good partners in ministry, really good and successful in ministry. He became an evangelist before we went to Detroit, was very successful as a youth and adult evangelist. I youth pastored in Florida myself, not like the pastor's wife. And that's when I realized, I can do ministry, not just be a missionary somewhere else. So I was a youth pastor. We both then started to do our own ministries, and we were successful, but we found we were growing apart. So we went to Detroit. This was now 15 years ago. And we thought, now we will be together. We'll do ministry together. And it grew fast. We were somewhat successful there, but our inner wounds, our childhood wounds were very clear, especially at home. And so the stresses of being senior pastors was taking its toll on us. And so we just knew, like Shawn had went all in on God. I had went all in on God. We just thought that when you struggle, just pray about it, leave it at the altar. That's all you need to do. Yeah. And we'd gotten some counseling, but it was like marriage counseling here and there. And like we had more than a communication or a money or a date night problem. We had I had a baby and just buried it and moved on. And he had been arrested and thought he was going to live in prison forever, and just got saved and moved on. And we didn't deal emotionally with so many things. And then we wondered why we took everything out on one another. And so in Detroit,
how would that look though? Help us. I'm sorry to interrupt you. How would it look like? What did that manifest itself like at home? Was it just really fiery fights that would pop up out of nowhere? Was it just a general sense of dysfunction in the house? Like, clearly you're performing well at church together, but behind closed doors, what was stewing?
Yeah. Well, I'll speak for you and then you speak for me. Basically, Shawn came from a really rough neighborhood, and his family he came from a poor home. And so he would view me through the lens of people he grew up around or his mom. So, and then I'm a Northern woman. We'll get it done. We'll get in there and work hard, and we don't, submit well. And so I wore the pants in the family. Even though when we got married, I was 17, I was almost 5 years younger. I still was wearing the pants. So then I was making it like I was his mom, and how I spoke to him and left him sticky notes for, you need to take out the garbage, do this, this, and this. Like he worked for me, not like we were married. And he would respond like a small child who was yelling and frustrated at his mom, not do what I had said, not fulfill my expectations around the house, and then blow up and yell or storm off like a child does. And how a child would want to respond to his mom. He knew he couldn't respond to his mom that way growing up, or he'd get spanked or beat. For me, he knew I'm a wife, and he's just going to respond how he always wanted to his mom.
Right. And I'll just interject. I really appreciate the the vulnerability there, because that's the part of the story that never gets told. And that's why pastors end up in such predicaments. And it's a self-made, sort of problem. I'm not saying pastors are victims necessarily, but when we have that going on at home, and then we also go to church and perform and talk to others from stages and in spotlights as though we know how family works, as though we're the model, there's an even deeper resentment that grows in a marriage when you stand there and watch your spouse get up on stage and lie.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And you bring it home and it just festers even more.
Yeah. And to go even more vulnerable, maybe, then we had kids. And so he's out either on the road as an evangelist where they're treating him to nice meals and putting him in good hotels. And he's on stage and gets off stage and hundreds or thousands are like, oh my gosh, you're amazing. And he comes home and I meet him at the door with a child with a poopy diaper. And I'm mad because I've been home doing this, but I have a call on my life. I have a career I want. And and this is what women do a lot behind closed doors. We just wear our man out because you don't take the load that I carry. And then this can be the other way around, but typically then he's getting treated so well in public and getting treated so poorly at home. And I remember when we were really coming to blows, I finally shared with my mom, like, Mom, we fight all the time at home. And she said, Sonny, I feel like what Shawn needs is to come home to an oasis, not to a war zone. And she said, you're saying things like he comes home at 6 or 7 now. He used to come home the minute he left work and he'd be home by 4:30. She said, could it be that he's dragging out coming home so that he has more rest before he gets home where he's supposed to rest? And I was like, ding, ding, ding. That was the beginning of maybe I'm some of the problem, because of course I wanted to think he was the problem.
Right. He was probably parked in the driveway in his car on his phone. That's probably where he was for like an hour and a half.
Down the street at Starbucks going, oh my God, I don't want to get yelled at. I don't know what I did wrong.
We mastered the art of avoidance, man.
But in honesty, there was a lot of things I should have been confronted about, because I was acting, and we could get more into the story of how we discovered this, but I was acting like a third grade kid. I would lie, I would cheat, I would steal, I would yell, I would operate on a fear and shame basis. And it is challenging, when you're in ministry. I think pastoral ministry it's different than being an evangelist, but there are similarities. But like when I was an evangelist, we would go to these big events and I would be with Sonny and my kids, or we would have interns. And bro, people would ask for my autograph.
Right.
And it's
mess with you.
It's like this celebrity thing that goes on where when you are damaged, you're not immune to the fact that you're damaged. You're not ignorant to it. Like I knew that I was shattered inside. And so I was trying to figure out not only how do I cover it up in public, but I would go through spells where I'm also trying to cover it up in private. But it's like a percolator. It would just get to a point where I would get caught in something, and I would always get caught. And Sonny has this great analogy where she says, like, God keeps her on a short leash, and she prays for that. And I felt like at times God had me on a choke chain. Yeah. And I would do things wrong, and he would make sure that I was caught in that thing. And I think in the beginning, I viewed it like God was mad at me for the things that I was doing. But then probably when I became a dad, what I realized is he's actually doing it for my benefit. He's doing it because he sees more in me than I see in myself. He was looking at me the way he looked at Simon. Like he viewed me as the rock when I just viewed myself as a damaged throwaway. And I think I lived most of my life feeling like Sonny was going to leave me at some point. It was inevitable. I was going to get abandoned. I couldn't break away from the insecurities of my life because I was living my life like a child.
And it just sounds so familiar to what you said earlier when you were younger. I just knew I was going to spend my life in jail. And it's this mentality, this sort of worldly poverty sort of mentality, scarcity mentality that gets set in our early childhood probably, that, anything short of Jesus healing it, we just carry it our whole lives, man, in secret, and it festers. Now, at some point, if I'm remembering this right, from what y'all have hinted at on your podcast, y'all had another tragic sort of outcome with another pregnancy. Is that correct? Do I have that right?
We did. Yeah, we found out that, well, we had a miscarriage, and then Sonny got pregnant, and almost immediately in the pregnancy, we were at an ultrasound, and the ultrasound tech actually left the room without talking to us and came back in with the doctor. And the doctor kind of went through the ultrasound with us, and they were seeing some abnormalities. And the doctor actually looked at us and said, "You guys need to terminate the pregnancy." And she kind of went through, what the challenges were, and the fact that the baby wouldn't go to term, and if the baby went to term, she would die almost immediately. And so we went, we were saved in a Pentecostal church, and so we had us a revival meeting. That's what we'd say. We had a special speaker come in, and we had multiple nights of youth services leading up to the actual due date. And the speaker at the time had us come forward in front of everyone, all our teenagers, hundreds of teenagers. And he began to prophesy over us that God was going to heal our child, and had all the kids that could fit around us come and lay hands on us. And he prayed and spit and sweat and shout. And we went the next morning, and she was born. And when she was born, she was actually worse than they anticipated. And so they actually didn't let Sonny see her at the beginning, and brought me up to see her in the NICU. And it was definitely, I mean, it was shocking. It was there. I didn't think there was any way that she would make it through the day. And so she lived 18 days, and man, we learned lessons that you never want to learn firsthand, but we also learned some lessons that you only can learn firsthand. Yeah. And I learned what it is to be mad at God. I learned what it is to use every profanity that you can about God and to God. And he didn't smite me. And we got to hold her. We got to be parents for 18 days. And it was the most heartbreaking thing. We had to actually physically pull the plug on her. And that was I've never had more pain in my life than at that moment. But at the same time, to feel this is just such a churchy word, but to feel the sovereignty of God in that moment, and to survive, and we had to figure out how to live life at that point. Like, how do you come back now to these teenagers who just laid hands on you, and a guy, how do you explain a failed prophecy? Right. But the truth was, she did make it. He wasn't wrong. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you had asked earlier, if I'd ever questioned my call. And that was the time that Shawn was like, we've been doing ministry. Like, he's like, I've grown out my hair. I wear suits to church. Like, God, I've given you everything. How could this happen? And he wrote a book later called The Gravity of Grief about this. And he talks about, even in the beginning, like, I wanted to walk away, not just from ministry, but from God. It's interesting how two different people do two different things, though. In that, he was angry with God and he wanted to walk away. In that, I took it as, well, this is judgment on me being a teenage pregnancy.
Wow,
this
really?
actually is the discipline and the vengeance of the Lord to say you shouldn't have screwed up earlier, and then you could have kids. And then after we had her, a geneticist sat down with us, and typically, we found doctors were like, your miscarriage and this is just a fluke. It just happens, and really no concrete reasons why and answers. So that's what we were getting a lot. But then a geneticist sat down with us and said, you guys are genetically incompatible. You need to stop trying to have children.
Oh, my.
So as we're losing our daughter and she's dying or is dead at that point, there was no hope, according to this person, that we were genetically incompatible. I'd never heard of that. Yeah. But again, I went back to, well, I guess I deserve this. So it's so interesting how two people will go two different routes, and we live in the same home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and worked in the same ministry. And, you know, it's, but it is interesting. And it's always interesting to me how do you lead your church through that too? You alluded to that. How do you come back to the same kids and church members that laid hands on you, you know, and your baby, you know, a few weeks prior, and then you say, well, you know, I guess it didn't work. Or, I mean, you try to make sense of it somehow. It's got to affect you. And it affected y'all's marriage too. It had to.
It was a delay, but it did. Yeah, there was a delay. It brought us together immediately. I think a lot of people that lose a child, maybe to cancer, or they lose babies at birth, it can be like, oh, but we're so close. But then, you know, especially because I was emotionally confused and had dealt with trauma from the past. He the same. So eventually it caught up with us. It was a few years later, about 6 years later, it caught up with us in our marriage, and just we caught up with ourselves.
Sure. Tell me about that season of life and what that looked like for y'all.
Yeah, I think we had just put our nose to the grindstone when that happened. We just doubled down on ministry. We wanted to become more effective. And probably a year later, we were doing these Friday night prayer meetings, and we had a 16-year-old girl that was listening to Sonny pray, and came up to Sonny and she said she felt like the Lord told her that she was supposed to come and tell her that by this time next year, you guys are going to be parents. It's going to be a boy. He's going to be healthy, and you need to name him Isaiah. And it was true. It happened. We got pregnant. Not we. I mean, she got pregnant, and he was born. And you know what was interesting? And I have nothing ill to say about the church that we were youth pastors at the time. It changed my life. My pastor there is my hero. But I think people were so tepid when it came to getting excited about our pregnancy, because they were like, well, this is what we know, and this is what we've seen happen. And so there were two people that showed up, you know, church of 5,000 people. There were two people that showed up at Sonny's baby shower
For Isaiah.
Wow.
And that was like a dagger to Sonny. I'm sure that she probably questioned, maybe not her call to ministry, but definitely our call to that church at that point. And so when an opportunity presented itself for us to go do a different type of ministry, that's when I went on the road, because, you know, I was like, well, I have to be supportive of my wife. And so we moved to Florida from Seattle, and we were living next door to her parents, and Isaiah was born on June 3rd. And the next week I had a camp. Wow. So, I mean, she has a week-old baby. We've just moved across the country, and I was gone for the whole summer. And, you know, for 4.5 years as an evangelist, I was gone almost all the time. And so I think in the midst of that, the seeds that were sown in the times that we were together took root in the times that we were apart. And they took root in ways that were deceptive. So the enemy started to weave these lies in both of our minds about the fact that we are better apart, when everything that we'd ever done corporately had always been successful. And so then when you had Sonny become a youth pastor, and she had one of the largest youth ministries in the Southeast United States, and I'm speaking in front of these huge crowds, it seemed on the outside like we were functioning better apart. But the more that we grew in our career, the more that we shrunk in our personal life. And so we didn't even know how to talk to each other anymore. And then we're new parents. And then a couple of years later, she got pregnant with our daughter. And I was at a camp, and she called me and she said, I'm pregnant. And my exact words were, what am I supposed to do about it?
Like we were dating.
And in my mind, though, Eric, I was afraid that I felt like we got lucky with one. Why are we tempting fate again? I knew my daughter. See, it's another one of these things that I knew. I knew in my mind that my daughter would die. She was not going to survive the pregnancy. I didn't even think she'd make it to term. And that if she made it to term, that she would be born and she would die. And I lived so much of my life in this fear that I was going to lose something. Because again, I have abandonment issues. I have insecurity issues.
Sure.
And so I think I was 100% a non-supportive partner in our early parenting. And I was like, well, you raise the kids. I'll be out making the money. And even though she had a full-time career, and it was like this weird boundary that I had in myself, or barrier that I had in myself, that wouldn't allow me to go all in, because I just knew at some point she was going to leave.
Right. It was easier and safer in your mind because you were believing the lies of the enemy. It was easier and safer to keep your distance, emotionally and otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to recover from that, honestly, in the realm of vulnerability, it honestly took for us to have a fall.
Yeah.
Like
so
something had to crumble underneath us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Talk to me about what led to that and the sort of dark night of the soul for your marriage. And I know there was at least a temporary separation for a while there. How'd all that come about?
Neither of us want to say
Neither
it.
want to talk about it.
We're pretty vulnerable, and that's the whole reason, for our podcast, The Rise After the Fall, because we're living in the rise after the fall. And many people are like, but it seemed like you had quite a good rise before, the fall. And we're like, it was meteoric. Our fall was halftime, and now we're on the other side of it. But the fall was about 15 years into 13 years into our marriage. And we went to Detroit, Michigan to become senior pastors, to try to merge these two separate lane ministries into one, be a family. And then we were like, at this point, I don't even like you anymore. But we did.
Yeah.
Like, we were passionately in love and codependent. I mean, we got married young, and it was fast and successful early. And so now we're back in this home that we love each other, but we hate each other and we don't like each other. And
that's complicated, man.
Yeah, it's very complicated. But I think there's so many marriages that way, right?
Absolutely.
And so Shawn was one, he would spend money and have it on credit cards, and I'd get the statement, and I paid the bills at that point, which is another bad thing when you're struggling to not be the mom of him and he's struggling to not be the child of me, the mom. And so I'm paying the bills, and I'm like, what is this? And he's thinking, I bring in all this money traveling, I can buy what I want, except I'm finding on credit cards. So it started as that. It wasn't drugs, alcohol, sex. It wasn't that. It was the sneaking money.
Yeah.
Sneaking, and he grew up poor. So like that was, you made it if you could buy what you wanted. So sneaking that. And then I think he just got good at that. And then eventually it turned into more and more spending. And then I found a credit card receipt, or a credit card thing came to me, and he didn't get the mail in time. And it said that it was for a Harley Davidson. No, it wasn't a Harley.
It was a Harley.
It was a Harley.
About a Harley without her knowing about it.
Ooh.
But he had told me that someone in our congregation in Detroit gave it to him.
Yeah, so some deception there, a lot of brokenness.
So at that point, I was like, "Oh, I think there's way more going on than I even think," and there was.
Yeah.
And so, then it did turn into relationships with other people, whether that was emotionally or it was, we had interns that on both sides. Mm-hmm. Interns on because we were youth pastors for so long. So I'd have interns, he'd have interns, and they would just be totally enamored by us. Yeah. And so it was the point we would cross the line in talking about our marriage with interns.
Right.
Like that right there is dangerous. You're in danger zone at that point.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, you've crossed into the dangerous territory, right? When you start oversharing, like telling people who have no business knowing about your marriage how sad you are or unfulfilled you are, or whatever. Like that's, you're past the point of no return in some ways. I mean, by God's grace, there's never a point of no return, but in terms of developing inappropriate relationships, you're there at that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the straw that broke the camel's back after, a decade of ups and downs and deceptions, I think the straw that broke the camel's back for her was that not only could I do something that was deceptive towards her, but that I could use the Lord as a lie in that. And so she's going, if you can if you can lie and say that God blessed you with something that you got at 22.9% interest, then you're beyond the scope of you've got a few little issues. She's like, this is like a spiritually dangerous zone.
Yeah.
And so
I don't know what you're capable of, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right?
So she came to me, and her parents were at our house, and she came to me and she said, I'm out. And she packed whatever she could pack in the back of her parents' pickup and my 2 kids. And she pulled her and her mom and my 2 kids pulled out of our driveway in Plymouth, Michigan, and left me literally laying prostrate. I always want to say prostrate.
That's an important distinction.
Laying prostrate like David in my driveway, bawling, begging her not to leave. And she left. And my father-in-law stayed with me. And my father-in-law stayed with me, and not because he loved me. He stayed with me because he was worried about me. Like, he viewed me like a son, and he was so mad at me because of what I'd done to his daughter. But he wanted to make sure that I didn't do anything that was irreversible. And so he stayed a couple of days with me. And, honestly, Eric, we experienced the same thing that you talked about earlier, where sometimes your indiscretions can be covered up by your talent. And my church kept me. Like, I went to my board and I said, Sonny's left me. I think we're going to get a divorce. And they said, well, you're not going to resign, are you?
We need you.
I mean, Sonny, how'd that feel?
Our attendance was blowing up every week. People were getting saved. It was bananas. And I just remember I was so torn about that. And I mean, I didn't want to lose my job because I needed the money. And in my mind, I thought, well, maybe I'll win her back. But after a couple of weeks, I was like, bro, she's not coming back. Like, she had divorce papers drawn up and they weren't signed, but this was like, no, this is really going to happen. And so she did come back, and we were separated, and we thought, well, maybe we can try to save or salvage this. And actually she came back, and she was working a secular job. We were living in 2 different houses. She wasn't even attending the church.
Yeah.
And they kept you.
And they still kept me. And
real quick, like, if I could just ask a question, like, after she left and you had this talk with the board, did you take a break?
Oh, none.
Not even
Zero
a Sunday.
Break. I didn't take Sunday off. I think
you're up preaching the following Sunday.
Well, I left on July 3rd, which was a Saturday, or a Saturday.
I think it was a
Friday. And it was like right before the 4th of July. And 2 days later, he preached the message, and he told them at that point. And the reason he didn't wait to tell the congregation is because neither of us had ever told anyone we were struggling in our marriage, except a few pastors who we went to them for marriage counseling, and they said, don't let this get out. We love you, get help, but don't let it get out, or you'll lose your position, you'll lose your job. So we kept it silent. And so when I told my parents, Shawn knew she hasn't done this in 13 years, ever let her parents know anything except we fight a little. So he thought, if she will tell her parents and she will leave me, because I would never even go to a hotel when we'd fight. I didn't send him to the couch when we fought. He knew that he knew this was it. So when he went 2 days later, he just told the congregation, he said, Sonny left.
And the congregation didn't leave, bro. It was just like,
so what did that communicate to you at that particular point in time?
Talent was the most important, that he was still only loved and adored because of his talent, which was a phrase he learned in college, that people will put their job on the line to keep me around, to get the school more attendance. And this isn't just the church, this is everywhere. We excuse celebrity all day long because it is a return on your investment, and he was a product. And so he saw himself as a product more than ever.
We talk a lot about the evils of objectifying people, like how we objectify women physically. This is another kind of objectification of people. And, I think, Shawn, you more than willingly accepted this objectification, at that point in time. But it didn't do you any good.
Oh, definitely not. I think it took me into a whole spiral of, well, I guess I can do anything I want.
Yeah.
And my wife can leave me and you're going to keep me around?
Yeah.
Bro.
I mean, I can do anything that I want to. But there was this, when she left, there was a realization in me that I remember the first time that we went to marriage counseling, we had this guy who looked at me and he said, Shawn, she needs to know that you need her. And I looked across him, I said, I don't need her.
Yeah.
Like, I am fully functional as a human being. I can cook food. I can wash clothes. I can do everything that I need to do.
Can buy Harleys.
Yeah, buy Harleys, lie. And my pushback on his advice was, I said, well, I don't need her, but I want her. And to me, that was like, it was even a step above needing someone. But later on, when she left, what I discovered is not only did I want her, but I also did need her. That she was the piece of me that God had destined to be put in place. And when she was gone, man, I was a wreck, bro. Like I reverted back. It was like I was in middle school again. I went out, got a big chain. I mean, I have a bunch of tattoos and I kind of was a thug growing up anyway. So I went back like thug mode. I went and got a dog. I got like a big bull mastiff and I was eating Hungry Man meals and watching Rambo. And it was like, dude, what? And after a couple of weeks, I was like, this is bogus. Like, this is not the life. And I think sometimes people think if they had a life that's different than the life that they have, then, the grass is always greener. Right. And I realized, man, I want to be a family guy. And I want to be in a place where I need to be a man of God. I needed some level of accountability. I needed people I really needed that board to look at me and say, all right, it was good knowing you. And what happened is I had a guy who called me. It was my pastor, Fulton Buntain. And there's no one on earth that I respected more than Fulton Buntain. He was like my dad. And he called me up. And he called me up and he said, Shawn, this pastor, and I'm just calling to see if you're still an a-hole.
That's what you needed.
Not only had I never heard Pastor Buntain swear, I had never heard him get sideways with someone. He was the kindest, lovingest person I'd ever met. And I said, I didn't know I was an a-hole. And he goes, are you and Sonny back together yet? I said, no, sir. He said, then you're still an a-hole. He didn't say a-hole. He said the word. He said, then you're still an a-hole. Don't ever call me again until you and Sonny get back together.
Wow. And
that was like the picture of what love and accountability was meant to be.
That's right.
And it was like, okay, not only did I not want to lose my relationship with Sonny, now I didn't want to lose my relationship with Pastor Buntain. And so it kind of pushed me. And then another guy called me who was Pastor Buntain's son-in-law, a guy named Rich Wilkerson, who he had kind of been one of my mentors growing up because Pastor Buntain was his father-in-law. And so he called me and cussed me out and told me, these are the exact words. He said, you need to get in your car right now and go get your wife back. You need to quit that church. You need to leave everything. He's like, go work at the mall. Do whatever you have to do. You need to go get your family back. You're being an idiot. And I had those two guys, and then I had two friends who were in my life who stuck with me. And, honestly, pretty much everybody else walked out at that point.
Did you take his advice?
I did. I got in my SUV and I drove to Florida where she was.
Did you quit the church?
We quit the church so she had come back and we wanted to transition them. So we had an understanding that I would come back and forth until they found another pastor.
So what'd you do when you got to Florida? Sorry to interrupt you, but what'd you do when you actually got there?
Well, he had his chain on, so I was immediately appalled. And I walked around my parents' house and ignored him. And he was super hurt and offended because, loving wives, even those of us that wear the pants in the family for too long, we still, they know we're the helpmate and the lover. And, I'll just be like, hi, babe. And I just was like, God kept me righteously angry. And I've told women that a lot. Like, you don't have to get a divorce to separate and ask God to keep you righteously angry so that there will be change. And I'm so glad God didn't just have me go back to him and hug him like everything was fine, like I always had. So I agreed to go back with the kids and live in a different house. And then he just started dating me. And and he just stuck it out because we'd go to date and sometimes it was with the kids and sometimes it wasn't. And most of the time I'd just look across the table and be like, you make me sick, like inside. And like, you're just a dirty dog. And so it wasn't just the slow dating. It was that then he found out about a program in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And we were currently between Florida and Detroit. And he was finishing up pastoring there. And we went to Green Bay, Wisconsin for 8 days for an intensive. And he went into a counseling session with a man and a group of men. I went with women in a different classroom. And they kept saying, focus on you. Don't focus on your spouse. Focus on you. This is you. And I got down to things that I realized were in me. And it wasn't all Shawn. And he actually wrote me a letter after his class, day 1 of 8. And he wrote in it, babe, as he always did, I love you. You're not my mom. And I was like, I have screamed that at the top of my lungs for 13 years. I'm not your mom. And he said, you're not my mom. And I knew, that's it, unlocked it.
Something's working.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it did. It started to rewire his brain, my brain. And we realized we never had a marriage problem. Sonny had a Sonny problem. Shawn had a Shawn problem. And they were equally devastating for both of us. They were different. So that's when I knew there was hope.
Yeah. And you were in this professional ministry together in some way that sort of didn't provide what you probably needed most at the time, which was this loving but rigid oversight, where there were sort of boundaries that were clear and consequences for going outside those boundaries and just plain talk like your boys did on the phone, Shawn.
Yeah.
Y'all didn't have that for years and years, and most pastors don't. Is that your experience?
Too many pastors don't have it. That's for sure. I think if you're in a denominational church, for some guys, they have that. But you do have to submit to that too, right? So even if that's available to you, if you're damaged on the inside, you're going to find a way to avoid the shrapnel. You're going to step around it. You're going to lie about it. Yeah. So you can have oversight, but if you don't submit to that oversight, then it's just meaningless. It's just window dressing. I know so many pastors who there's all these different rules and regulations as a part of their either denomination or fellowship, and they're doing those things anyway. And they're lying about it. Nobody knows about it. Or their boys know about it, and their boys don't hold them accountable to it because their boys are doing it as well. And so, and it can be something so simple like alcohol. Like when I was in the Assemblies of God, there was a rule. You used to have to sign a card every year that would say you didn't drink of the alcohol. And if I was going to sign the card, I wasn't going to drink alcohol. Right. But I had friends who were pastors who were drinking alcohol. And I'd be like, I don't think alcohol is a sin. I think too much is. But here's the thing. If I have made a commitment that I will not drink alcohol, and then I drink alcohol, I do think that's a sin. I think I've stepped over the line. And so I think that there's people that are living their lives in secrecy, that if they were just open and honest about it, but if you're not in agreement with the oversight that you have, you either have to fix what's broken in you, or you have to find an oversight that you are spiritually, ethically aligned with. So if you have if you say, I'm going to drink a glass of bourbon once a week, and that's against the rules, then either you shouldn't do it, or you should find a place that'll say, oh, you can have bourbon once a week. But it's just a matter of getting yourself in alignment with authority.
Yeah, and sort of being your own authority figures for that season where it all was going haywire, and not having any oversight was sort of another ingredient in this perfect storm of chaos that y'all ended up living through. I just want to hear one more piece about the past that you left behind at that church, and that's just, Sonny, I want to hear how it felt for you when that church sort of just said, well, Shawn, you're not leaving, are you? Let's keep going. Like, how did, from a wife's perspective or a spouse's perspective, how did that hit you when you learned of that?
Well, man, since our podcast has started, The Rise After the Fall, we were in season 2, so it's not been going that long, just over a year. The way in which women reach out and their story of it confirmed the very thing that still exists. That's just this unwritten rule or this understanding. And so at the time, I didn't think anything. I was more concerned about my marriage. And I was like, whatever. I, at that point, was willing to leave not just my marriage, but the church, because I knew it was one and the same in our life. I wasn't going to get to leave either without leaving the other. And so at the time, I was like, oh, well, this is what I expected. But it's a sad thing that it is what I expected. I was on full-time staff. I was the executive pastor. I basically led the staff, similarly to what I do now for a couple churches currently. Is Shawn preached, and Shawn had the vision, and Shawn was, the main communicator. And then the other things I did for the church staff and the church. And I was disposable. It was just, so he's not here. Okay.
Ooh,
okay.
It's rough.
Who filled in the void were a bunch of associate pastors, and then it got all kinds of dysfunctional. Of course it was going to be dysfunctional. Here is a separated man still getting to be up there like nothing happened because his preaching was insane and they loved it. And so we had, people, on staff, there was infighting, there was talk, it became gossipy around the office because there was a void of leadership. There was a void of culture and staff relations. But nobody really thought, well, that was a big deal. They just filled in the gaps. So when a pastor falls, when a pastor leaves a church, if the wife was a big part, you lost 2 staff members. You didn't just lose the lead visionary. And that's why the domino effect of this is the church can really struggle for the next decade. Yeah. And they think it was just the moral failing, but it was a moral failure followed by systems and structures fell apart. If in our case, that's what I brought to the table. So now I hear women's reach out. I'm like, actually, until you just asked that, I never thought. I guess I felt like a lot of women who are reaching out after hearing our podcast feel now.
Disposable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Brutal. I don't think in all the interviews that we've done, Eric, no one has ever asked her that question.
No. Well,
it could have something to do with the fact that my wife and I are in ministry together and have been for a long time. And I think about her a lot, actually. And if anything were to happen to me or, not a falling or a failure necessarily, although that's always something we have to watch out for. But if I drop dead, like, would the church surround her? Like, I think I'm getting teary thinking about it. But like, it is a concern, and you want a healthy enough culture that we are who we say we are, right? And
it's not to interrupt, but what's interesting is that I think sometimes we look at the person who communicates and we think that person is the one who created the culture. But in our case, that's not. I don't create the culture in any of the ministries that we've been together in.
That's right.
She's always been the culture creator, and I've been the communicator of that culture. But it's because she's communicated the culture to me. And so, like, I've often said, like, if it would be more of a detriment to Life Church in Green Bay if we lost Sonny, than it would be if we lost me. And I'm not saying that to be false humble, but the thing is, it's easier to find somebody who can communicate than it is to find somebody who can create culture.
That's right.
Because there's tons of great communicators out there, but not a lot of people who can create a Christ-centered culture that's so easily accessible.
Yeah.
And so, when we had our fall, I thought I was just going to leave ministry. Like, that was my goal, honestly. Like, I wanted to just go sell shoes at Nordstrom and be done with it. And I was unemployed, for a long time. I couldn't get a job. What I realized is I don't have very many marketable skills.
Yeah. Same.
And so I felt like Sonny when she had been called to ministry and she felt like she had to go be a teacher overseas, which I didn't know if you were a Christian woman, you couldn't teach in America until right that moment that you said that. I didn't know you had to go overseas. But I thought, well, I don't know. What am I going to do? Am I going to be a teacher? And I applied for jobs and I couldn't get a job. And so it almost became where I had to chase both my wife and my calling all over again.
Right. Is that how you ended up in Green Bay?
Yeah, we ended up in Green Bay. Well, we ended up going for the program, the intensive. And then we lived there for a number of months, and Sonny worked at a coffee shop and I was a stay-at-home dad. I like to say I was a blogger, but no one read my blog.
Yeah.
So I was
It's a sad life, bro.
I know, dude. I was making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. We only had heat in half of our house. We went out to eat as a family one time, and we went to Pizza Hut. We got a medium pizza, and we all shared a Pepsi. And it was the greatest time of my life, because that was the first time, honestly, that I read the entire Bible. I'd been in ministry for 13 years. I hadn't read the whole book. And so I was just, I was picking and choosing what stories that I was going to, and half the time I would preach sermons and I didn't even have much scripture in them. It was a lot of stand-up comedy, a lot of storytelling. And so I had a guy who asked me if I would go work at his Christian school in Oregon. And I did that for a few months. And I had a guy who was an overseer for a fellowship of churches who I was familiar with and who was familiar with me. And he flew in and told us that we were wasting ourselves not being in ministry and asked us if we would come on staff at his church. And I said, I had a few stipulations. I said only if there was one particular city that I wouldn't move to, which of course that was the city that they made us move to. And Sonny became their marketing director. And then they asked us if we would go be campus pastors at their campus in San Diego, which is, it's a tough sell. So they moved us to San Diego. And a year later, a church in Green Bay that we had attended when we lived here, their pastor left and they were going to close. And so they reached out to us and asked us if we would come back and we would take it. And the reason that we're so endeared to Green Bay is it was the first place that we were ever healthy. So there's a connection there for us. It's the first place we've ever done ministry where we've been who we were supposed to be. And I think that's why God has allowed us to have so much success, is because from the very beginning, we've been honest about everything, both privately and publicly.
Yeah. And you just want to ferociously protect the sweetness of it and then the innocence of it, right? Because you've seen how bad it can get if you don't, right? Yeah. So I love how you guys have taken what some might call the shame of your lives, the dark parts of your lives, and just allowed God to shine a light through them and to turn all that shame into glory for God. And you're doing that by not just building your church. You're doing a great job by all accounts with your church, but you feel a burden to do more than that for churches and pastors and church leaders to sort of shine a light on what's going on in churches where the systems and structures or leaders are just off, and how many people get left, lifeless in the wake of these things that happen in churches. Pastors are falling all the time. So what has sort of, if you could help me understand, just led you guys with all you've got going on to make sure you leave some time to do this podcast, to start this retreat center where you are right now for pastors and pastors' spouses, church leaders in trouble? Why are you doing all of this?
Shawn, during the pandemic, Shawn preached a series on Acts and Romans. Anyway, it ended up being this really great case study on the Apostle Paul. And he's an apostle. And I felt connected every week when I would hear it to how Paul did things. And then Shawn was preaching it, and I was like, is he feeling what I'm feeling? And so it was during COVID that just made every pastor question their call, their position,
Yeah.
their sanity. I mean, many people were the target of a lot of hate during COVID. Pastors were up at the top of the list, and you couldn't do anything right. And so I'm listening to this message over and over again every week, and I'm learning from Paul that Paul, he had a thorn in the flesh. Paul struggled. Paul had issues with people he worked with, and they had to part ways, which happened with many church staffs. It happened in ours, and we were devastated, and yet I connected with that. And then the word apostle and apostolic kept being spoken over us. And we realized God was calling us to be apostolic. But, you know, some words like prophet, prophetess, apostle, bishop, some of those things we're either confused by or turned off by, right? It's like a lot of Christianese words. And I think we rejected that, even though it was God was putting it on both of our hearts, that we needed to step into an apostolic function. And so we determined we needed to be open to whatever that was. And so there were a couple churches that reached out. We started helping their pastors, whether it was with their worship set or worship videos during the pandemic, because, you know, people were losing entire worship teams. And so we started to help with our worship set via video, and we would help pastors, and we'd bring them in and go through our Journey to Wholeness program, and it would save their marriage. Or we'd fly out and it would be NFL or ex-NFL players and their spouse, and keeping their marriage together. And so we started traveling more, having some of our staff help all over the nation during COVID in this program that saved our marriage, helping them do that. And we're like, okay, maybe apostolic means apostolic in helping, not just apostolic of church things.
Yeah.
And so we have a church now in Toronto that we are helping lead in a transition for the pastor eventually to retire, and us to come in and help, but not come in the form of taking over, but coming in an apostolic way. Where Paul was an apostle, he would speak to Timothy, or he would write back letters to the church of Ephesus, Corinth, Philippi.
Right.
And he would encourage, exhort, and challenge and discipline. But there was someone on the ground locally. And so we have someone now on the ground locally in Green Bay, our location pastors there. They're the day-to-day. And after 10 years, we were able to say, you're in charge of the day-to-day. You're a location pastor. We're the apostolic lead and senior pastor. Same thing as what we're trying to get established in Toronto. That probably will happen with other churches. We've been contacted by a couple different pastors on search committees. Like, can we do that more than like resignation and hire somebody from a resume? Can you help us? And then this retreat center just literally fell in our lap. And this is where we really feel, Shawn had said, this feels like this will actually be my life's work. And I mean, we've had 20 some years that we've been working for the Lord. But we, now more than ever, pre-pandemic, we wanted to help pastors.
Yeah.
And now it is an epidemic in its own right of pastors who are burnt out, who have questioned their calling, who have walked away, or they're only still at their church because if they walked away, they'd be a free blogger. They'd be unemployed. Their wife and kids would just be left out in the cold. So they're holding on, but it's not because they want to, and they're hurting. And so now we're here to help for that.
I'm so glad you are, but it's still this devastating sort of reality to come to terms with. But it's better to know it and to acknowledge it and go after the problem than it is to just let it fester in the darkness and silence. So what are some of the common denominators for healthy church cultures that allow for their pastors to thrive and be healthy and be accountable? Like, what do you see as some of the most common guardrails there?
Well, I think guys aren't transparent. They aren't vulnerable, partially because of fear. Maybe they feel like if they own what it is that they're caught up in, then they're going to lose their job. I mean, let's say you're a staff pastor and you're struggling with a particular issue, and you go to your senior pastor. You're running the chance that you're going to get fired. If you're a senior pastor and you go to your overseers and you tell them that you're having a struggle, you're running the risk that you're going to get fired.
Sure.
Some of those guys need to get fired.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just be clear about it. Like the best thing that could happen to them, and we've told this to some of the couples that have come to us, hey, the best thing that could happen to you is you fall on your face, because you need a healthy dose of humility.
Is there a line there? Like, where do you draw? How do you know who needs to go? Like, is there a line of?
guys that are trying to hide it, they should go.
Okay.
They either should resign or be honest and submit themselves to some sort of a process. And so the thing that we're encountering with pastors is that they are so busy trying to keep their ministry intact that they're failing to keep their life intact. But if they would take the time away, because here's the thing, I just told a guy a couple of weeks ago who he was like, well, I can't come clean because then I'll lose my job. And I said, I would rather go be a barista at Starbucks and have a good relationship with my wife and with the Lord than preach another day on a stage. And I say that from experience, Eric. I had to get to a point where I was like that, where I was unemployed. There are worse things that can happen to you than you not have any money. Mm-hmm. There is a path back to it. And it's not necessarily that our goal is to get people to be restored back into ministry. There are pastors in churches right now that if they died in a car wreck, they're not going to go to heaven. Mm-hmm. They're great communicators, but they're terrible people. And the thing that people have talked about us that shocks them is how blunt we are.
Yeah.
Maybe part of that comes from the fact that I'm an ex-con. And I go, listen, we have people's eternity in our hands. And we're going to mess around and go, but I'm not going to have my 403B anymore. Like, bro, like
crazy
you're
how
leading people down the highway to hell. And there are guys that, even guys that are in incredibly successful churches that if they were to fall, they would do more damage in their fall for the kingdom than they ever did good in their rise. Because you're going to have people who not only are going to be affected spiritually, but you'll have a whole generation of people who will walk away and will never come back to the faith. So now the stakes are so incredibly high. So we try to be a firm hand with a velvet glove, which sometimes there's a fine line between that. But what we want is we want to give guys an alternative to say, okay, you can't tell your pastor or you can't tell your overseers, come and talk to us. Let's come up with a plan. Okay. So if you have to take time away from your church, maybe you should go through our program. You can sit in our church or in one of the churches that's connected to us. We've got a good handful of pastors who are on our lead team. So if you don't want to come to Green Bay and sit for 6 months and work a secular job and go through the counseling that you need to, maybe you want to go to Columbus, Ohio, or maybe you want to go to Dallas, or maybe you want to go to Sacramento, or wherever our other lead team guys are at. But let us put you through a program and let us help your church make the transition. So if somebody on our lead team, maybe their board or their overseers are going to be understanding and they're going to say, yes, we love our pastor. We don't want to get rid of our pastor, but we want our pastor to get healthy. What if our lead team could fill in and be interim speakers for you? And so, yes, now you get to go back to your church, but not only do they get your talent, they also get your integrity and your marriage gets restored. And your kids are now going to not be typical PKs who walk away because they feel like their dad or their mom are a fraud.
Well, and some people that 6 months, they're like, I can't even go there. I couldn't keep my job. My board wouldn't let me be gone and then keep it and all that. We do an intensive over a 2-day course. If someone is straight up in the middle of an affair or they've embezzled money from their church, I mean, it's moral or legal, then yeah, you're going to have to really consider more than take a weekend and come to our retreat. But if it's like, we just fight all the time and it's just, we've been doing this for years. We're just fed up. And now I'm starting to drink my bourbon every night of the week to get through being a pastor. Well, probably a 2 to 3 day intensive with us at our retreat center, because it's not just you come and you sit and you refresh and you retreat. We have a program that's like the 8 days we went through that saved our marriage. We have a 3-day pastors intensive, trauma-based, neuroscience bridged with scripture, a rewiring of the brain. It takes 3 years for your brain to completely rewire, but you have to start the process. And we start that in 2 days with us, that you could catch a lot of falls. And we want to be in the prevention business, not in the you already fell business.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and just for in case we have pastors or spouses or church leaders who might be in desperate need of this, how would someone find that you're talking about right now, those intensives?
TheExchangeCollaborative.com, just all spelled out. TheExchangeCollaborative.com talks about our program. Also, it talks about our reserve, which is called The Reserve, and it's our 20-acre property in North Carolina that we have our first retreat next week.
Great. Awesome. So we'll put all that information in the show notes and program notes so people can find them. Talk real briefly about the podcast itself, because that's where I've really gotten to know you guys and your work. Why did you decide to start the podcast?
Well, when we listened to the rise and fall of Mars Hill, we were youth pastors in Seattle. We knew the impact that Mars Hill had on Seattle. But the more we listened to that podcast, the more it made us go, I don't even think I want to be in ministry anymore. Like, it feels so yuck. It feels so dirty. And as people who kind of are in that megachurch world, we felt like maybe the times have changed and there's not a place for this. And it was an addictive podcast. It was like, man, I was binging it.
And for listeners that may not know, like the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill is a long form story based podcast about a real church that was just like a rocket ship, just thriving under a very charismatic leader in the Pacific Northwest, and it just came crashing down in the most awful and horrendous way, and left a lot of people in its wake. And so this podcast was, I heard it referred to as beautiful as it was and as well done as it was, kind of like trauma porn in a way. Is like, it was just devastating. But at the same time, you couldn't turn it off. And so that in a way inspired you guys to start your podcast, which, I mean, even the name of your podcast is a take on the rise and fall of Mars Hill, right?
Yeah. Well, I think like as we listened to that, I would hear them talking about the senior leader, and I would find myself going,
Did I do that?
Did I do that? Is that me? Do I have that in me? How many people did I hurt? And then how many people did the church hurt? And by the end of the season, finding ourselves going, no, we do want to do church. This is what we're called to. But there have been so many people who have been hurt by churches, whether that be their leaders or whether that be their followers. Yeah. And so we didn't want that to be the end all of the story, to say, yes, there was a rise and a fall of one particular organization. But that doesn't mean that represents the church capital C. That was a church small c. That was one church. And yes, there were other churches, but there are other great churches and organizations that are doing it differently. And for those people who were wounded by that, we have a 19-year-old and an 18-year-old who grew up, in a healthy church environment. But at the same time, there are certain things that if you bring up certain topics, they will tell you how they felt like the church let them down in that regard. And had they not told us that, they would have been 37 years old trying to figure that out on their own. And so to go, okay, well, then there's a whole generation of people who have gotten perhaps mixed messages, even if they were unintentional. Yeah. So how do we kind of bridge the gap between that podcast and our podcast? Right.
And I love you guys tell stories and have people on telling their stories that really capture shades of these downfalls in churches that a podcast like The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill can't really capture in its highly produced way. There's so much honesty and just brutality in some of the stories that are told, but that need to be told. And I mean, one story recently was the wife of a pastor who had really screwed up. And I mean, in some of the most awful ways imaginable, I guess. And, she dealt with feeling disposable too, and had to fight to be, looked after at all by the church that claimed to love them and was employed by that church, and let go by that church. And it's a gripping story, but it was a really important, full of really important lessons for churches and church leaders today. As you think back on the year plus that you've had with this podcast that you're doing, what stories, if you could pick one story that has stood out to you as sort of, it just sticks in your mind as sort of symptomatic of what's going on in many churches these days, what would it be, you think?
I'm probably thinking of this because it was one of the most recent. It was with Brandy Wilson of Leading and Loving It. And she was a pastor's wife that her husband, she actually knew of affairs throughout their marriage. So it was complicated and it was messy. And then finally there was the final straw. And actually he wanted to divorce her. And so she was still going to hang in there. And I think but then she loves the church, and she showed her boys after, I love the church. And the church as a whole, the church, the bride that Jesus said it didn't mess me over. People did. And unfortunately their dad did, but she still loved the church. And I think in the process of our whole podcast, our brain wants to close the loop and end, right? It wants to put a period on the end of the story. So Rise After the Fall, or the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, it wanted to say, and so this guy's terrible, and anybody else who's a Christian or a megachurch person that's all about it, they're wrong, period.
Yeah.
And what I find in our podcast is it's messy, and every story is messy, but humans are messy. And so there isn't a close the loop. Like Brandy is still working through the process of where does she fit? And yet she's holding on to, I still love the church. Wow. And everybody's story, we say the Holy Spirit isn't weird, but people are. The church isn't wrong, but people get it wrong.
Yeah,
it's
all the
messy.
time.
Yeah.
Well, what would you say to someone who's listening? We tend to try and speak straight to the heart of skeptics and people that are sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out with Christianity. And sort of as a final question, what would you say to them, especially those who have either directly or indirectly been harmed by or disillusioned by bad actors in the church, right? Or unfaithful Christian leaders that have wounded many, and maybe that's caused them to question whether Jesus is for them. Is there a word you would have for them today?
Well, I think the word that has been used a couple of times here has been disposable. And I think when we say the wives have felt disposable of the pastor who had some sort of a moral failure, I think that there's a whole generation of people who have felt disposable. And they're the victims that they never get to tell their story. I was just reading a story about a pastor in Canada who pastored one of the largest churches in Canada. And he had this brutal fall. And then all of these victims of it, if you would, and it wasn't like they were direct victims of being sexually assaulted or something, but this guy was their Messiah. And all of a sudden he's gone, and now their church is gone, and everything that they had kind of built their life around. And so there's this whole generation of people who, because of the fall of one man, they feel disposable and they don't get a voice. And I think the word that I would give to a skeptic, because I am one, to this day, I'm a skeptic. Yeah. I would say you are not disposable. That scripture says he will never leave you. He will never forsake you, that he is a friend that sticks closer than a brother. And I'm telling you, as a guy who has had his nose deep in the dirt from falling on his face, he never one time left me. And my father-in-law was a picture of that. My father-in-law loved me, but man, he was mad. But even though he was mad, he loved me enough to make sure that I didn't do something that I was going to regret. And that's the God we serve, a God who doesn't like some of the things that we do. Obviously,
but he doesn't
totally contrary to what he asks us to do, but you're not disposable in his hand.
Wow. Praise God. You guys have blessed me today, and I know you've blessed everybody listening in, and I'm really, again, not to inflate y'all's egos, but y'all are doing some amazing work, and I've been personally blessed, and I've benefited from it, as has my wife. We listen to your podcast together. And, just sort of as a tune-up, a check-in, sometimes it really serves us well. And I just praise God for all the ways he's using y'all so effectively. And he's really brought you through so much. And so much. Yeah, right.
Well,
but
consider yourself personally invited to come see the reserve and stay there and take it in.
Hey, I love North Carolina, so I'll be taking you up on that.
Good.
And I hope that everybody will check out the Hennessy's work. We'll leave all of the appropriate links in the show notes. Tell us again the title of the name of the podcast.
The Rise After the Fall.
The Rise After the Fall. I can't recommend it highly enough. So thank you guys, Sonny and Shawn, once again for spending so much time with us today.
Thanks.
Thank you.